Genshin Impact has a rather archaic way of loading things. Your average game will load and unload things based on player proximity. In other words, they utilize draw distance. Too far away from the enemy or location in question, it unloads or turns into a lower resolution version. And while Genshin certainly does do that, it also has old-fashioned loading zones thrown into the mix. If you cross these invisible lines, enemies, objects, landmarks, whatever, all vanish into thin air, despite the player being right next to them. This may open paths that were otherwise inaccessible, something that can be very prevalent when exploring outside the map. But one of the most interesting things about it is how enemies are treated once unloaded. Let's take a look at this ruin grader in Inazuma. As seen here, the guy is rushing us down, but if I put just 1 foot forward and step past the loading zone, the fella is whisked away. So where do you think the ruin grader went? He almost certainly went back to his original location, is possibly even inactive again, right? Nope. The game stores the enemy exactly where they were before the loading zone is crossed, although their previous action is interrupted and they're back in a neutral stance. This is a strange design choice, especially for a game with online co-op, because if the game is loading things based on these zones rather than player proximity, what happens if two players beside each other are standing on opposite sides? Well, what happens is it creates phantom enemies for the player outside the zone. Let's take a look. Thus, we have a phantom ruin grader. For one player, it's loaded in and attacking as part of an intense battle. For the other, it's less an intense battle and more a crazy game of charades, with some special effects. Those who have played a ton of co-op may have seen a sight like this before. Really strange, but also really cool. It's peculiar that we can see anything at all. One might guess the attack effects would not show up, and instead we'd see a player getting damaged and tossed around by absolutely nothing. A true phantom. But they are visible, which begs another question. What happens if the attack effects touch the player standing outside the loading zone? Our destination for this experiment is Fischl's Island in the Golden Apple Archipelago of version 2.8. Specifically near the beachside theater. There's a loading zone right here. Crossing it will cause enemies from the nearby hill to unload. Enemies that can be aggroed and lured. The plan is to push an enemy past the loading zone. While this sounds like it should be impossible, remember that these things only unload stuff when the player crosses them. As silly as it sounds, an enemy can exit their specified zone and remain loaded in until the player also exits. And yes, the game stores them in that location. Ranged attacks must be used to take them out, since they will unload when attempting to melee. To help with this test, I invited a friend along. We've lured a hilichurl archer, and by walking near it, the archer backed away over the line. The traveler is standing in the exact spot as the hilichurl, although from my friend's point of view, the hilichurl was pushed slightly aside due to both myself and the hilichurl being loaded in. The load zone in question is this small space between the traveler and Zhongli. Thus, we can test what happens when a phantom enemy attacks a player. Despite being attacked, the game doesn't register this as combat. I'm able to open photo mode, pose, do whatever. Eventually, the traveler gets KO'd. And the archer starts to attack Zhongli. Took about 4 minutes, but Zhongli finally fell. This fellow was the one shooting us all along, now visible and running back to their spawn point because I'm within the load zone. These zones are difficult to find in the much more polished Mondstadt and Liyue areas, even Dragonspine, but are quite noticeable in newer locations. Golden Apple Archipelago in 2.8 was littered with them, and the underground caverns and ruins of Sumeru's rainforest and desert have so many. Like this one near a Thunder Law Churl. One barely has to move away from the Law Churl before it and the rest of the enemies vanish into thin air. With how common they're becoming, I'd imagine more and more players are starting to notice them. We talked a lot about ranged attacks, but what about melee? What do those look like? Nothing. Melee attacks cannot harm the player outside the load zone. As seen here, the enemy will certainly try, but the character is completely unaffected. Unlike ranged attacks, melee ones do not load anything in. Since nothing new loads in, and the enemy is unloaded, its hitbox cannot collide with the player. Ranged attacks work because something new loads in, and that something does not abide by load zone restrictions. Very neat. Thanks for watching. Odd mechanics like these are something I often explore in Genshin Impact. So if you're curious to know more, feel free to drop a like and subscribe and check out the channel. I sometimes also share snippets over on my Twitter, @Moosashi. This is Moosashi, signing off. Till next time.